Well, welcome everybody to our spring budget committee session, and glad that most folks could be here. And I'll turn it over to Shauna to do the roll call.
Right. Elizabeth Zeller,
Here.
Lynn Carson, here. Jinwin Chai is absent. Shannon Grindy,
Here.
Gary Rebello,
Here.
Jamie Rye, Shima Salehi,
Here.
Joe Buck, absent. Ali Afghan, absent. Trudy Corrigan,
Here.
Masin Mbu, absent currently. Aaron Raft,
Here.
Rachel Verdick, late, and John Winland.
Here.
Wonderful.
Well, great. Well, thank you, everybody. This is our spring off year meeting for the budget committee. And we have a not huge agenda, but really looking forward to that long-term view of the city's finances that I believe Sean will be presenting with Martha. But the first item on our agenda is approval of the minutes. Hopefully everyone had a chance to read them when Shauna sent them out. And I would entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as provided.
Again, any discussion, corrections, anything? And then do we need to do a roll call vote? Or just we
You can
can
just say aye.
all, okay, all in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? With that, the minutes are approved, and we'll turn it over to Sean and Martha. Thank you.
Thank you. So here's our agenda for the evening, and we've already done the roll call, of course. You did the approval of the minutes. We're going to go through the general fund, kind of strengths and vulnerabilities. I'm going to start off with a 6-year forecast that we've seen during the budget cycle before. I've updated it for a year, and hopefully we can spend a lot more time going into it and what it kind of means 6 years out. Then we'll move into back into the PowerPoint slides, and then some revenues, some expenditures, specifically with the personnel costs. And then if there's time and willingness, we can do the utilities, which is pretty quick. It's stuff we did at the Master Fees and Charges meeting back in December. And the other thing I'd ask is, if you have questions, just ask them throughout. Don't wait till the end. It'll be more fun and more interactive if you're asking questions throughout it'll focus me to where I need to go, and because I could talk about this all day. So anyway, so with that, we're going to move to the 6-year forecast. Okay, so most of you are familiar with this 6-year forecast. We do it every March for the budget cycle. This is kind of really showing the general fund and only the general fund. And it's really just showing the operating budgets for each of the departments. But what I mean by operating, it's not taking into account reserves. It's not taking account, it's just taking into account the amount of revenues, annual revenues that come in, and the amount of annual expenditures that go out. And then it kind of shows us what it should look like 6 years out. Do we still have enough, funds available if we keep all the programs as they are now? And if we keep, if inflation and stuff like that is normal or what we expect, this is what the picture looks like. It does have the ability down here to adjust. Basically, it was made you could roll a die, a 1 to 6, and then you could plug it in there because no one really knows what's going to happen. But so like 1 and 2s is low, and 3 and 4 is medium, and 5 and 6 is high for each of these different things. So like, is new development going to be higher? It'll change the actual rate that we're expecting. Or franchise fees, are we going to get more in franchise fees? Or in this case, we're talking about alcohol tax or transient lodging. And, this one we're going to talk a lot about. Inflation, is it, higher, low? And how are our medical costs affecting things? These are some of the bigger things in the general fund that kind of affect everyone's budgets. And so right now, setting it at medium, it's basically saying that you can kind of see these up here, how it kind of affects it as you have your, inflation is about 3%. And over the last 10 years, I'll have a slide later on, but that's kind of what the highs that we've seen over the last 3 years, the 10-year average of inflation has been about, our CPI for us is right around 3%. And then kind of what it means for like PERS or medical costs and all the different things right here. And it's kind of based on that down there. But to kind of show that we are in a good in a good place 6 years out. If nothing is changing, what you can kind of see here is this says in year 6, so we're talking about 2029, that our total revenues that we're giving out to the departments is, and this is in thousands, so $66.3 million in revenue be given out, and then their expenditures are 65 point, we'll call it 66 million. So it's just slightly more, and we still have another 1.7 million in annual unallocated. And what I mean by unallocated is there's always that small amount during the budget cycle that we can move toward different projects. So there's always a small amount that as we increase what we give police, fire, parks, and everyone, we give them the same increase on their revenues each year as we get overall in the general fund. So say revenues go up by 3.2% in the first year and 2.8% in the second year, we give that to them. And there's always this smaller amount. What you can kind of see here, to make this balance in the out years, we had to give them not just 100%, these would all be 100%. We had to give them like 100 and, 20% of their normal allocation out in those years. But it's not 120% of the total amount of money. It's just, say we gave them an increase of 3%, we had to give them 120% of that 3%. So it'd be like 3 point something percent. And by doing that, you can kind of see that. And then this graph right here is really representing over the years. Oh, I forgot to change this. It's 24 to 29. But what this showing is this is the amount of the unallocated. Over the years, our unallocated is actually going down. You would think this would go up if these were all at 100%, but to make everything kind of balance, depending on which departments have more personnel costs, because personnel is kind of the bigger driver of everything. Those ones usually need more of the allocation out the years. And that's, like I said, and that's assuming that we don't make any changes to that biennial budget each cycle. This is just saying this is what it was in this biennium now. If we don't do any changes, this is what we're going to have to do. But as we always do, we kind of make adjustments through every biennium. So we shouldn't be, but I guess I'm just going out at a high level right now saying, yeah, out at 6 years, we still look good. The other thing that's going to happen in 2029 that isn't on this graph is that will be the first year that we're anticipating getting the funds from the East End District. It shouldn't be closed down by 2028. So we'll be able to pay off the bonds in 2028. And in 2029, we should be able to get the initial money from the East End Urban Renewal District. So our portion of it. So right now, it gets a little over $17.5 per thousand. 4.97 of that's ours. So it's about $2 million a year. So in that out year, in 2029, we'll actually be looking a little bit better because in that year, we will get more revenues because of that district closing down.
So can I reiterate something that you just said? We're in good shape if we stay the status quo.
Yes.
We don't add program.
So that's a key factor to know that, I mean, we're fine if we continue to do what we're doing. But if you add a whole bunch of new programs or new expenditures, then that's when we wouldn't be so great.
Yes.
Right. So we have sustainability of what we're currently doing.
Yes. So to go back to the first thing that we're talking about, strengths and vulnerabilities, some of the strengths for the general fund is, our revenues are very stable and they don't really change much with the economy, good or bad. So when the economy is rolling and everyone's homes are, increasing by 50%, 60% in real market value, the city still gets a 3%, change in their property taxes. But at the same time, when they've all gone up and now they're on their way back down just because of the way the economy and interest rates work and housing comes, the prices come down a little bit. There's such a difference between what assessed value is versus real market value that we don't feel that either. So, I mean, it's extremely stable. I mean, I don't want to say boring, but I don't like to use that word, but in my job and what I do, boring is great. You know, no excitement.
Uneventful.
We like that. So, but yeah, it just makes it, and it's just the way that the Oregon property taxes work. Some of the vulnerabilities though is LORAC. We don't actually, we know what we're told LORAC, you know, the operating deficit it's going to have. We don't know because we haven't run it yet. Even after, if it opens up in September, that's going to be missing the whole summer.
Not gonna open it.
It's not even, you know, but we're gonna, you know, we're not gonna even have a full year that first year. So we're gonna have to go a couple of years to figure out what is the actual operating deficit of it. It might be more, it might be less. We don't know. So that's, the unknown is like, you know, again, I like boring. That's like, it's not good. Yes. Like,
Will the LORAC sustain itself through membership fees? No?
No.
It's
No.
free?
No, I think we have estimated, and I'd have to go back and look, that it will cover about 75% of its operating costs.
And so the delta is sizing it
about 400.
for, okay.
You can't, yeah, the expenditure, the cost of running it will be the same, no matter how much revenue we bring in, and that's the challenge of operating it.
And
then-
typically it's,
It's very normal for a local government to have to subsidize a recreation and aquatic facility. It's especially the aquatic side, just because the cost of running an aquatic program is so staff intensive. Actually, also very capital maintenance intensive. So it's very normal. In fact, if you recall, those of you who were on the council back in 2019 and 2020, the dry side recreation will actually likely subsidize the aquatic portion of the operation. Pools are expensive. Any of you who've owned a pool know that pools are expensive.
Questions? Okay. And then our other vulnerability, which I'm going to show you right now, is inflation. And I'm going to do it by just kind of adjusting down here. If I come down here and I actually adjust inflation and make it high, so it makes it from an average of 3%, which we've seen over the last 10 years, and it makes it 4% over the next 6 years, which is worse than the inflation we have now for the last 10 years. But if it happened, what it shows is, okay, all of a sudden, you know, our expenditures are 68.7 million in year 6. Our revenues are 66.8. So it's about 800. And then, you know, it's still at 1.37. So it helps. I mean, I think we're fine, but that is kind of the biggest driver in what would cause us to have issues. If your revenues are raising by 3 to 3.5%, but your expenditures are raising by 4 to 5%, eventually it won't work out. But again, we're set pretty well that, okay, in the 6 years.
That's certainly some of the economic news. You start hearing the word stagflation again, but our revenue doesn't go up or down. To your point, it sounds like it's just very steady. Well, it goes up, but very steadily. So it's really the inflationary, the expense side that's going to hurt us.
I think the only one that's really, and we'll get to the slides later, that actually breaks the revenue down. But I was going to start with this model is it's transient lodging taxes. So in 2020, actually 2020 wasn't as horrible. 21 was actually worse
Was
because
really bad.
I mean, it was bad, but the next year was actually worse. But then it's kind of on its way back, but we're still not to
But
the
compared to
2019.
other jurisdictions, we're less dependent on revenues that are tied to economic cycles than other jurisdictions. Sean's going to show you, but
Yeah.
80% of the general fund is property taxes, which is, as Sean says, completely insulated in Lake Oswego from good years or bad.
in your model, you show energy prices going up at 2%. And we just experienced a 17%
Yeah.
electric and a proposed, I think, 12% or 7%.
Yeah. So that affects the utilities way more than it affects the general fund. The general fund really is City Hall. So yes, it does affect the cost of the utilities here, but it's not nearly like it affects the water plant and then stuff like, and the intake and stuff. Where I think energy bills like closer to $1 million a year. this is actually pretty low in comparison.
Right.
But yes, yeah, that's could be updated. I think when we built this, that was back, there was some point, I don't know, 5 years ago or whatever, PG actually went down and Northwest Metro went down and then they were kind of flat for a while. So again, if you're taking over a 10-year period, yes, these 1-year jumps, we're trying to flatten them out and model it for at least 6 years. So. Okay. You guys mind if I leave the model and talk about some other stuff? Okay. So what I was kind of talking about earlier, there's two kinds of revenues I kind of see in the general fund. Those that are department specific and those that are non-department specific. And I'm making a distinction between these because what I mean by department specific, we have fire contracts with Dunthorpe and Lake Grove. We have 911 services we do for Milwaukee and West Lynn. Those costs actually go to the fire department and the police department and all the like $3 million in parks, rec fees, goes right to parks and rec. That helps offset the other like property tax money and franchise fee money that goes into it, the cost. And so those, the way we budget, those actually go straight to the departments that they're supporting. Kind of an incentive, like you want to better in your budgeting and you want more programs, then you could offer, if you can find a way to make it work, so we give them their own money. But then the non-departmental is like the specific, things such as like property taxes and franchise fees and state share revenues. Those are then divvied up between the other departments. This kind of breaks down how they are, I mean, what they are, but this is also really points out that property taxes of that non-departmental kind of specific revenues, property taxes make up 88% of our property tax. That's what makes us so stable. Again, boring, I like that. And then the next largest one is like here at franchise fees. It's like 7% of that number. It's not even a tenth of what property taxes is. And then the next largest one would be like state share revenue. Again, that's basically liquor tax. We get a little bit in cigarette tax, but that's like $2,000 a month. So the liquor tax is, it's full over $1 million. Then the next one would be the hotel motel. So the transient lodging taxes, it's about 2%. And then we have one cell tower lease, and that kind of is what makes up. The cell tower is just right over there. It's like $50,000 a year, but it's what kind of makes up that money that then goes to the different departments. And the difference between, this and like the utilities that we're going to talk about a little bit is these are kind of, we don't get to change these. Our permanent rate for property taxes is our permanent rate. We'd have to go out for a local option levy like the school district or another special district or that's another place to actually get more or raise our property tax. I mean, there is a small amount, like 6 cents per thousand that we can raise. I mean, our permanent rate's really 5.03 and we just do 4.97, but that extra 6 cents, I think our property taxes are like 40 some million right now. It would bring in, I think it's like $75,000 to $80,000 per cent. So 400,000 at the most, I think. So it wouldn't, it's not money, but it's not going to make a big difference if we need, like if you needed an emergency or something like that. So these are pretty much set. The only one that really isn't is the transient lodging. And it's so small. And I think it was after 2008 or 2009. If you adjust it, 70% of any of the amount over that adjustment has to be used for tourism. The 30%, so say you raised it another 2%, you get 0.6% that could go to the general fund, but then 1.4% would have to go toward tourism things. Hence why we have a tourism fund in our budget, is because we did raise it back 2008 or 9. Yeah.
There's other restrictions though, and there's also market. The county has a 6% lodging tax as well, making the total that a visitor pays 12%, which is really it's the market rate. So if you were to want to raise it, you would be raising our tax above comparable jurisdictions. For some hotels, that might not make a difference, but given that many of our lodging is on the freeway across the road from other lodging in another jurisdiction, you might actually have a competition problem if you were to raise that tax. And that is one of the taxes that's highly vulnerable to economic change. So
What is the 2023 general fund total amount revenues?
I'll have to look that up. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I will get back to you on that one.
Okay.
Are you talking just the total general, like revenues, the
Yeah.
total? Okay.
Total revenues for 2023 and for the general funds.
Okay.
Around 40, right?
So that's the property
that's the property
taxes.
tax. It's
So,
around 65 or 70 in there somewhere total.
yeah, my,
But we'd want to look it up to be precise.
yeah, I think yeah, it's probably around 60 million, but I want to look it up. So like I said, you can kind of see that this is how our property taxes have grown over the last 2010, so the last 13 years. So the red is the delinquent taxes that we collect. And so we don't, we levy, we assume we'll get 97% of it eventually because 3% gets written off because everyone takes the, but not everyone pays their taxes. And so we get the delinquent, and you can kind of see in 2019, we have a large one, but that was Comcast. That had to do with the Comcast and a lawsuit. So that was kind of a one-time. But what my point, the real thing here is you can kind of see that it's,
Thanks.
Sean?
Yeah.
How much of that growth is with like a tear down to a new house? Or is it just a natural?
so we average about 3.5% increase in AV every year. And this is really taking not the urban renewal areas. I mean, it's higher in urban renewal areas. It's probably like half of the increases. It's like 6 or 7% annual increase. And so instead of being 3%, it's like that. But so this takes up the urban renewal areas. So the increase, I said, it's averages around 3.5, sometimes 4, but it's really roughly about 3.5. So the 3 is that we already get. So about 0.5% is, some of it's tear down, some of it's just remodel, some of it's addition, some of it's
New development.
a little bit of it's new development. There's not that much new development, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Martha told me she knew it, and I didn't. She was right. But I always kind of come in a little low because I'm like, to give myself, this price is right. It's better to be lower. I'm kidding.
Question.
Yes.
Who's responsible for collecting delinquent property taxes?
It's all done by the county,
Okay,
so we don't collect any of it.
not a city responsibility.
We don't even have, no. So yeah, so then another fun tidbit about this is this actually has nothing to do with how the city of Lake Oswego pays its taxes. We are just one part of the levy. Everything goes to the county. So in theory, a whole town could not pay their taxes, but we would still get a portion of it. This is how the county pays. So of every dollar, every levy in the county, we're like, fractions of a cent probably compared to everything in the county. Every dollar that gets paid in gets divvied up. And it just kind of keeps everyone kind of fair, and then how the county collects it also. We didn't pay our taxes and Westland paid all their taxes, we would still get tax revenue, and everyone in the county wouldn't get any, as much because we didn't pay ours, kind of a thing. But it's all based on county collections. It's not based on by city. And then this is kind of how all of those revenues are allocated. So this is straight out of the budget. You can kind of see police makes up a big chunk of it at 33%, and then fire. The big difference between the two is police, they have the 911 center, so they pay for 100% of that, even though a good chunk of it really is for fire service too. But this is something you don't usually see at the other cities around here. What makes Lake Oswego's Parks and Rec 24%. Then add, the ACC of 3% makes Park and Rec 27%. That's the same amount that we pay fire. That's what makes Lake Oswego, Lake Oswego. Now let's kind of move on to some of the expenses, and this is, some slides that I usually show during master fees and charges, this one. This is really talking about just, our CPI, what is the city's. You can kind of see in 2014, it was around 2%, and it's been low, which is good for certain things, but we'll get to PERS and you'll see why that's not good. But that's the other side of the double-edged sword is for investments, it's not so good, but for expenditures, it's great. And for selling debt, it's great and stuff. But unfortunately, we have to deal with both sides of it. We have pensions that deal with investments. And so when you're doing great with low CPI on your expenditures and that kind of stuff, you're really doing pretty poorly on your investments and things have to be, yeah. Anyways, but you can kind of see that so in the last 10 years, the average was 3%. That's what the red line's basically just showing the average for the three, even though at one point we're at 8.4 and 6.2 or something like that. And again, this is because it's 3%. This is why in the 6-year forecast, I'm using 3% for inflation as what we think it's going to be in the long term. I realize it's going to go up and down and stuff. Questionnaire? Okay. Next thing is headcount. So, bodies. This is always a question. So you can kind of see the y-axis on the left is showing the total FTE, and the y-axis on the right is showing the number of FTE per 1,000 of the population per 1,000. And so you can kind of see we've gone from 9.7, and then we've gone as low as 9, and then with LORAC, we're kind of back up to 9.3. That's kind of that big spike there at the end. That's just adding the bodies for LORAC. And you can, I guess what's not on here is, in 2010, our population was a little over 36.7 thousand. And I think in 2022, what we used for the 23 was 41.1, 41.2. I think so. I think it's currently it's like 41.8 or something like that. But that's what it was a couple of years ago. But you can kind of see that we've kind of brought it down. A big part of that spike there in 2012, 13, that was the lowest team and the LO Tiger team that we're building. We had 5 or 6 FTE that were dedicated to building those 2 projects. Oh yeah, lowest was the Lake Oswego interceptor sewer. So the sewer pipe that goes through the lake. So 90% of all flows in Lake Oswego go through that. Well, I don't know 90, but all the flows that go into the Portland, plant go to that, and then the ones that go to CWS don't. But yeah, so it's about 90% of the flows. Now, PERS. So this is, back to the personnel costs. So UAL is the unfunded actuarial liability. So this is the amount of if we had to make good on all the pension that is earned today, even though you're not taking into account that people aren't going to retire for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. If we had to pay that out today, this is the amount that is unfunded. The little downturn in 6, 7, you kind of see there where it's actually negative and there was an asset. There was 2 things going on at that time. One, it was after the dot-com bubble and before the housing bubble. So the housing was still going up. And so the market was doing great. And there was some lawsuits in PERS where they were trying to make some changes to the tier 1 and tier 2 things. And so when they did they made it down in Salem, they made the changes. So we had to do it as if they did, but then they lost in court. They got challenged in court and then got overturned. And so the actual liability went right back to where it should have been. And so that's kind of what that little spike in 6, 7 really kind of shows. But what you're seeing here is over time, because inflation was low, so returns on what they're expecting, because they're investing for 50 years or more. So they're going long term. With everything being very low, it made that liability larger as liability was still staying the same, or the total liability was the same. But then, so the unfunded part just got larger and larger and larger. I mean, it's still to this day one of the best funded pensions in the country, but it's that's what this is kind of showing. And I said that, like, where we're talking about inflation earlier, and I said, this is where we're going to see where it's really bad. Where we've sold lots of bonds at really good rates. We'll kind of see, like, we haven't had really high COLAs for staff. I mean, just things have been really low and our costs weren't going up at 3%, but now this is the other side of it. So there's two things that fund first is the the returns on the investments. So they get all these returns, and what the returns are, they get them through rates from the employers. And when the returns aren't coming in, they raise the rates on the employers. But in our case, yeah. They also have on those rates. They have what they call curbs on both sides. So they don't raise it like we were going to get this much and we didn't. So we're going to charge you now 100%, where it used to be like 20% or something like that. They can only raise them like 3 to 4% per year. So it keeps this, even though rates keep going up, it also keeps the UA unfunded part going up. Now with investments doing better, the UAL might come down, but still having a UAL isn't going to help the rates because the rates were kind of being artificially stopped, collared, and then so they still have to raise them to get to the UAL to get to zero. Next slide.
So basically, they're pushing the liability out further.
Ready.
They're basically spraying. It's like getting a 15-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage. You're going to pay a lot more interest on a 30-year mortgage, but it's
Question.
going to take your time.
Do we do studies on or analysis on like our aging population getting closer to retirement? What portion is due when? Just so that there is some way to plan in case the investment returns were not optimal at that moment.
PERS does a little bit, and that's the next slide. This is from them kind of giving us an idea. I don't know about the dollar part of it, but they used to give us rates that you could plan on for the next so many years so you could project out. But the key here that I wanted to show is because of the collaring and because of that, it's not until about 2040, 2041 that the
Figuring out
rates,
a big portion of it.
yeah, it kind of levels off. And it's so a lot of this increase is more due to just inflation. I mean, just people's wages going up each year by cost of living and that kind of stuff was going to raise that. So we're kind of plateauing, and I'll show that in the next slide. But this is really what, in a long-term effects, it isn't till biennium 24 or 2041 and 2043 is when there's just, I mean, I hate to say it this way, but the tier 1 people are dying off.
Enough of us are dying.
Yeah, and they're being replaced by the observed people that, yeah. I mean, like I said, there's more people coming off the plan than going on the plan. I guess
Yeah.
that's a nicer way of putting it.
That's a good way of putting it. Thank you.
But because of the collaring, it used to be before they did the last collaring, because they made the collaring even narrower, I mean, now than it used to be. We were planning more like 2037 that it would do this, but the rate increases were going to be more upfront, more painful. Now they're not as painful, but they're just a lot more of them. And it's pushing it out till, like I said, 2041. And their current version that they're giving us.
So could you go back to that? So the bar graph keeps getting bigger. But that means that the contributions from payroll will continue to increase?
Yes, it's for two. It's one for COLA and one for an increase. And they have been increasing over the years, over the last few years. Well, it's every biennium by a little over 1 percentage point or 1.5 percentage points. So if it was 28%, it's 29.5% or 29%. And this next slide will kind of show that. In the 2011,
15.5%.
yeah, I mean,
Payroll.
personally,
Now at the end, it's going to be
Yeah.
32 or
so
33%.
yeah, so the red graph, the red bars are total wages. It's all wages. It's not just per eligible wage. It's just all wages in the city. And then the blue line is the total amount paid to PERS, and that's again on that left axis and in millions of dollars. And then the green line is what percent that blue is of the red. So you can kind of see that, yeah, like Martha was saying, in 2011, it was more like 17%. And in 2020, it was 28, 29%.
And it's going to be 32,
Yeah, and it's
33.
it'll go up a little bit more, but it's flattening out a little bit up there.
Right, but I mean, that's still in between 2011 and 2024, you're gonna be paying 17 cents for every payroll dollar, and then back in 2011, and we'll be spending 33 cents for every payroll dollar.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right.
So
Yep.
do people understand that? So it's kind of like this hidden tax that is levied against our payroll. So, and payroll is our biggest expense. And so essentially, we may have the 3% bump in revenue, but potentially it could go more and more into something that is not necessarily, and I'm all for retirement programs. I'm just wanting everybody to understand that we may have less for operating costs. We have to spend more money in kind of the payroll tax. I mean, it would kind of per person, it would be like taking the Oregon tax rate from 17% to 30% of your wages. That's how you kind of look at it. So it's not I mean, that's a 50% increase. Actually, it's more than that, right?
It's doubling. Yeah, I mean, it's an obligation that the city has to, I mean, the hardest part, and I've done this for a long time, is that a lot of this is an obligation to employees who don't work here anymore. But that was the deal they got.
Oh,
That's what the courts have
right.
told us. And so there we go.
It's not changeable, I'm not saying, but I just want everyone to understand that sometimes we will have increases in payroll costs, that you won't have more people. You're paying a sort of an expense that you're not really getting another person, you're just paying more for that person. So.
And one of those reasons that green line is kind of flattening out is in 2011, there's a couple different rates, but generally you have like a tier 1, tier 2 rate. Then you have an OPSRP rate, like a tier 3 rate. And they're generally 6 to 8% different. Like one might be 22%, one's 28%. And the makeup of the employees that we had in 2011 versus the makeup that we have in 2023 is almost inverse. So you can kind of see here, we had 74% in tier 1 and 2 back then, and now they're at 27%. And then we started with 26 in OPSRP and that. So basically, as PERS has gone up a little bit, this has kind of offset a little bit of those rate increases because it's kind of weighted it differently, that we're paying a different rate, even though the rates are still going up. Our makeup of our employees is changing.
And they think it'll top out around 32, 33% and flat in what time period? Like, I mean, with this graph, we know those rates are going to come down.
Yes.
It's going to flatten, but when? It's the
I would-
2041.
I would have told you that it would flatten out and more around 2035, 2037. But the way that a couple of years ago, they changed the collaring and made it
Right.
where it doesn't go up by 3 percentage points every year. Now it's like 1 to 1.5 percentage point. It levels out more around 2039.
So the blended rate will still exist for a long time.
Yeah, it will, but you'll see the blue line probably get, closer to 0% eventually. I mean, by the time that goes down, it'll be above 1, but it'll go way down.
Be some
Yeah,
tier
'cause
2
these are
people
our
left.
existing
Yeah,
employees.
Because we're
right?
really
So
talking
that-
like,
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you think about it, tier 1 ended in 1996 and tier 2 ended around,
2004, I think,
2002. 2000.
around.
yeah, somewhere in that 2004, 2005 time period. So if you think about the career of those employees, anyone who started here, who's tier 2 by 2035, 2036, they're probably going to be thinking about retiring.
Yeah.
It's always surprising how many folks work well past their retirement.
Okay, so this is, you know, a big chunk of our personnel costs. So we kind of talked about inflation and how that does the COLAs. We kind of talked about PERS. Now on some happier news, our healthcare costs. We've actually, you know, they were raising like everyone's, but then in 2020, they started heading down. I mean, there's one big reason, which we'll get to, but well, part of it was we had a bunch of people retiring, so younger people came in, so there was a different mix, but our HR, our assistant city manager, HR director, and the benefits committee went out and looked for
Went
a
out to bid.
different, and went out to bid and brought rates down like 20-some%. And so that was kind of
Okay.
huge. So you can kind of see our 2023 dollars spent is less than our 2020 dollars spent, less than our, like, it's almost equivalent to the 2015. And these are just total dollars, not brought back, and they're not adjusted for inflation or anything. These are just the actual dollars. I didn't go, okay, and 2015 dollars or 2011 dollars, this is what they equal. So it's, no, it's actually pretty good. So this is actually offsetting a little bit of the PERS increases in our personnel costs. Is our healthcare costs have actually gone down. Now, you know, they'll probably start rising again, but that was a pretty good.
And we were able to keep the same benefit levels,
Yeah, we were able to keep essentially the same plan design.
which is great. I mean, that's huge.
We're self-insured, right?
No.
No,
We're not. Okay.
we're not quite
Sorry.
big enough.
If you want to cause me to have our conversation, that I think we just don't have enough covered lives
Okay.
to be big enough to be, I think, Gary, you know, that 1 out of every 7 years, you're going to have a bad
Oh,
year.
yeah. Yeah, that's
And
right.
unfortunately, it's not, if you could predict it was 1 out of every 7, it'd be great, but those 1 out of 7 might come 2 or
Really
3
have to
years in a
have it
row.
well-funded
Yeah,
to cover that.
yeah. And if we can bring costs down in a different way.
How many full-time employees do you have right now? Total count?
About 350. I can give you an actual number because
Yeah,
Shauna brought me the book.
Previous.
It was on a slide. that
Couple of
was back
slides
there.
back.
Oh, okay.
And remind us the personnel, for the general fund, how much is personnel? Is it 80?
I'll have to look. I think
It's around 80%.
That's what I remembered. Okay, yeah.
Somewhere between 75 and 80%, but Sean's going to give you a more precise
Yeah.
number.
But it really drives the budget. All of these different costs are really what drive the general fund.
yes, because we have, you know, capital, you can, unless it's an emergency, you can kind of push it off a little bit. I mean, it might cost you twice as much if you push it off a year, but if you don't have the money, you don't have the money. These costs, when you have to cut these, you're really cutting staff, and then you're cutting programs, and you're cutting, so. Then the next slide is kind of what are the total annual benefit costs, and again, nothing's really, you know, the blue's the total benefit cost, red's the wages, and green's kind of as a percentage. And so what you're kind of seeing is in 2011, it was about 48% of total costs. In 2023, it's about 58% of total costs. That 10%, if I went back to the PERS, what you would see is PERS has actually gone up about 12% in that same time frame, but healthcare's gone down 2%. So that's what the 10% is kind of made up from. So is the optional stopping area or more questions here, or we can move into the utility slides and I can go through those.
I guess maybe I just ask a question to Martha.
Yeah.
We've talked about some of the vulnerabilities, hoping from a budget perspective.
Right.
What else keeps you up?
I talked to Councilor Wendland about this earlier today, that whatever is happening out in the streets, are my police and firefighters going to stay safe at night? That keeps me awake at night. Actually, the LORAC coming online is a significant thing. And I'm going to answer Lynn's question, which is, Lynn, before the LORAC, we had 359 FTE, and once it's operational, 383, roughly. Inflation, construction costs, desire to add programs that we can't afford. Counselors hear me talk about this all the time. There's I'm of a philosophy that when a government, that government should be something you can count on. So when a government adds a new program, it's something we ought to be able to sustain over the long haul. Lots of times we want to be responsive to community demands, and the problem is if we're responsive to community demand without thinking about a long-range forecast, then we'll end up being unreliable, which is very bad for government. So what keeps me awake at night? People want more than we can actually provide. Yeah, and I just think it's a community with really high expectations, so we shouldn't do a mediocre job. So if we're gonna take something up, we need to do a great job with it. So inflation, construction cost escalation. That's it.
Other questions from?
You want to talk about the utilities?
Pardon? Yeah.
Want to talk about the utilities with people already?
Yeah.
Take a
Yeah.
quick
You need
break.
pizza to keep you awake?
Can we take a
Committee
quick break?
A break? I'm
Minutes.
guessing that the.
15 minutes?
I could
15
do it,
minutes?
I can do it in 5 minutes.
Yeah, unless somebody you really need, let's just keep going and. we'll
Can
wrap
I
up.
ask you one quick question on LoRac? As you mentioned, it was probably projected to do 75% of its cost.
pretty
right?
normal.
So- Right.
Right.
So the 25%, is it allocated from a particular line item and a particular
No, it's
account?
general revenues. It's general revenues. So, all of the general fund services are ones where you can't generate enough enterprise activity revenue to sustain it. That's why we use taxes, right? So no, it's all an allocation of general fund revenues. And you'll probably recall that during the budget process last year, we substantially increased the allocation to Parks and Recreation to deal with the subsidy
Right,
that's
the
required to operate the LoRac.
Got it.
I think the only parks program that's self-sustaining is the tennis center. All of our other parks programs require a subsidy.
Did the pickleball situation ever get sorted out?
I haven't heard that word in 2024, so thanks for bringing it up.
Currently, it's cost neutral.
Yeah, because you mentioned tennis and I remember all of that stuff.
Yeah, the indoor tennis center is self-sustaining, so we bring in enough revenue for the indoor tennis center to cover the operating costs. But I think in Parks and Rec land, that's the only one, because the golf course requires a subsidy as well.
And,
Compared to other cities our size, is our park budget on the
We have a
large side?
very,
It seems,
we have a very robust park system. It's not for me, it's not a budget question.
Right.
The amount of effort, the amount of operational effort we've decided from a policy perspective to put in parks is much higher than communities that are comparable.
that's.
And I also think the diversity of the programs that we offer through our Parks and Rec program is quite unique.
I think it's great. I wasn't trying to.
No,
I
I'm
think-
I'm not making a judgment either, other than I think it's hard to go find another park system that has a farm. I haven't found one.
I think just send a note out to all of us, talking about revenue increase.
Yeah, and we have a policy to cover our direct costs for all of our rec programs, so that revenue will cover the direct costs, but it doesn't cover any of the overhead or indirect costs from those programs. Those are subsidized with tax dollars to try to keep the program affordable. We also do offer scholarships to folks who can't afford it. But no, when I think about just the suite of programs and the extent of our actual physical park system, it's much larger. I have worked in one other community that also had a very large and robust parking system, but even they didn't have a farm. We did have a gun club, which we don't have here. So.
one thing that she's alluding to, LoRac keeps her up at night a little bit because we are increasing our staffing considerably. And as she said, it's going to be open. And so the real question is how much revenue we can develop. And so the costs are there. And so the real challenge is to try to get the programs up and people to be using the facility, and the revenue model basically comes to fruition.
Well, and the demands for use of the LoRac I have run swimming pools before, and the challenge of managing a swimming pool is, you want to make sure you provide great services to all of your different types of users. And there's often a lot of competition from those various users for the same hours in the pool. And sometimes you have to explain, I'm a lap swimmer, you have to explain to me that I'm a low revenue hour, and so that's why I'm going to swim at 6 in the morning, as opposed to some of the higher revenue opportunities. And I think it's not just challenging from an operational perspective, it's challenging in terms of making sure you're satisfying and meeting the needs of the people of the community.
Do we have a two-tiered revenue system for if folks outside the
Yes.
community want to?
Non-resident.
Yeah, we charge non-resident rates.
And we're also in partnership with the district on LoRac. So that unto itself is going to be part of our complexity of running a facility with another entity. We're technically running it, but they're
Well,
going
and
to be-
again, the challenge will be how do we meet the needs of the competitive swim and water polo
Right.
programs, making sure that they're getting value for the program that they're offering, but we're also making sure the facility is available to the community. It's not only complex from a financial standpoint, it's a complex operation,
And the district will be contributing to
operating
the
dollars.
operating costs.
Yeah.
So just so everyone knows, it's not a free deal for the district. That's part of the joint,
They kind of own part of it.
right?
With that, we could go to utilities, Sean, if there's no other questions.
Okay, so these are the slides that I just showed back, I guess it was the end of November for master fees and charges. And these are more that probably, they're 6 years, but more like the 5 years. And what this is basically saying is, again, net operations is, what are they netting from their revenues minus their operating expenses? And then how much capital are we doing? And then the red bar or line is really showing the fund balance. Is it going up or down? And what we're really trying to show most of these is, an ending fund balance of, $4 to $5 million in the various funds. And we're trying to keep like a $3 million capital reserve and $1 million, roughly, it's a specific dollar amount for each of them, but roughly about $1 million operating reserve or contingency in case something happens. And so with the street fund, probably the most complex thing about, or what's its strength, but at the same time, it could be a weakness is it has multiple areas that it gets its revenue from it. The rest of them are pretty much, they just have a fee on your utility bill, and that's where the money comes for that. The street one, there's a street maintenance fee. There's a straight share revenue. And this one really kind of shows where the money is coming from the last so many years. So the state share revenue, that's like the gas taxes and your DMV fees. It's probably more DMV than gas taxes these days, but that's the money coming from the state. And then you can kind of see in the purple, that's when the general fund started. In 2014 was the first time the general fund really gave money to the street fund, and it was like 784,000. And then after that, we tried to give them, anything that we had left over to try to get some of those, the street maintenance on, like just the arterials. When I first got here, there wasn't even a lot of paving getting done at all. So the idea was just to get as much paving as we could. Then you see a spike in 2017 from the general fund. And that's when we were starting to build the maintenance center. And the general fund actually had to transfer money to the street fund because the street fund didn't have any money for their portion of the maintenance center. So you'll kind of see a spike there, but you can kind of see that's kind of where it is. So I guess one of the vulnerabilities is now that the street fund is kind of getting dependent on the general fund to do a lot of the actual projects or a lot of paving, and not all of them, but it is. And then you can kind of see the county registration fee is a small little red one that showed up in 2020, but Martha alluded to, so I always, the other vulnerability is inflation, but it's the construction costs it is going up faster than inflation. It's usually more like 8 or 9% a year for construction costs, or inflation. So street fund, water fund. Strengths, it's, probably one of its bigger strengths is the revenue is actually pretty stable, and It does go up a little bit or down a little bit based on weather, like in the summer. If it's raining, we don't quite make our goal. And if it's sunny, then we get a little more than our goal, but that helps offset some of our rate increases. I'm trying to say the other strength is most of the capital's been done now. Now it's just the ability to not raise rates and try to get a reserve for the next time, so we don't have to raise rates by 100% over 4 years again. So that's the biggest thing in the water.
You want to explain the bump? Because that's a bond, right?
Yeah, so
In
this is,
2025,
so in 2025, 6 or 26, 27, but in here we have it in 26, 27. So there's a anticipated bond based on the latest water master plan to do, and then the projects get done over the next 3 years, and that brings the capital or the balance back down to $4 or $5 million. It shouldn't increase rates. It's all within the rate model. So rates will increase every year, but it won't be this spike in rates to cover the bond. And you can kind of see this one. I just always show the annual billed water consumption, and it just shows that there was some water conservation actually happening after the tiered rate structure went in there. You can kind of see before the tier rate in 29, residential with 36,000 people was over 1.4 million units. Units is 748 gallons. So, and then even in the hottest months, we're still not even reaching that with 41,000 people. Sewer, again, it's pretty stable. The biggest probably vulnerability in this one is the wastewater treatment plant. When is it going to happen, and what is the cost going to be? We have estimates. We have good estimates. We have that, but again, this is probably what keeps me up at night more than anybody else, is this actual fund right here. So then stormwater is actually in pretty good shape for the shape. I can say, in pretty good shape for the shape you're in. I say that we've been raising the rate here to get it up higher to actually do some projects and that kind of stuff. The one thing is there isn't a lot of stormwater systems in the city. With the village feel, there isn't gutters.
Yeah, so this is a place where I think there is significant vulnerability that doesn't show up as financial vulnerability, and that much of the community was built basically without stormwater infrastructure.
Or sidewalks.
Yeah, well, and that shows up in the street fund as well. And they go together, as you all know. If you put in a sidewalk and a curb, you got to put in someplace for the water to go. We're going to be updating the stormwater master plan in the relatively near term, and I think that the condition of this fund will have to respond to what we learned. The other thing, and many of you have heard me say it, that as a longtime Western Oregonian, I can say that the nature of how rain falls is changing. And so how we size the stormwater system will probably have to accommodate more surges than we might have done in the past. We've definitely learned that in the last few years, that you can get a day's worth of rain in 45 minutes. It never would have happened in the past. And so how we build a system for the type of rain we're going to get is going to be something that probably won't be free. Wow, good job. You did it in 13 minutes.
That was a bit faster. But basically that one is, I guess the big difference between the utilities and the general fund is general fund, our rates are pretty set. We can't really change those. Council, the citizen, can change utility rates too if there's an emergency or some drastic thing that happens. So those are, we're projecting out based on what we think the rates are going to be, could be, but if there's an emergency, it won't hit it the same way it will hit the general fund. So they're not as vulnerable. Any questions?
I have one.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm full of questions today. I think when we're doing the bigger budget discussion, you both had mentioned that the water sewer systems is more of a response to whatever pops up, because there's an aging, set of them, but you can't really just go and dig up all of them. So whatever needs the attention gets taken care of, right? If I recall.
That's how we
correctly.
do the maintenance work. Also, from a capital perspective, we do incorporate a variety of factors, including the age of the pipe, in how we plan to replace or otherwise work on capital maintenance on
Yeah.
our pipe system.
Got
But
it.
yeah, there's a whole lot of responding, because if a pipe is only 40 years old, we expect we got another 40 years of life,
Right.
but we respond if something happens.
So having said that, and then the last couple of, ice storms that the city has experienced, I'm just curious, because, I was one of the households that had a water main break, and I
Oh.
didn't find out until
Inside
later.
your house or outside your?
Outside, thankfully.
Oh.
So it wasn't so bad, but it had me curious, if that happened to residential houses, did the city observe something of that sort happen to our systems? And did you see a spike in cost that maybe we should start to kind of build out some prediction around? Because 21 was, a big ice storm. Now there was another. So if we have to think about this every 2-3 years, what was it like? to deal with
That's a good question, and I'm going to actually give it back to the engineering department to think about. I will say every time we have severe cold weather, even if we don't get to have the January storm like we have, we do have water main breaks. And part of it is because you can't, in your maintenance of your streets and your storm systems, you can see it, right?
Right.
In your maintenance of your water and sewer systems, you're going off of experience and construction data. Sometimes things happen in how projects were constructed that turn out to create a vulnerability for the system that you don't find out until you have a cold weather event. And what happens, of course, is we have a cold weather event, and then as things start to warm up, that's when the water
Right.
mains break. But your question about should we have a sort of a factor
Yeah.
for knowing that this is going to happen every year is a good one. And let me pass that back to
And
them.
I'm curious if the city had to put in extra money for, fixing of things that happened that was on the city.
We know there will be a certain number of water main breaks and sewer main breaks every year, so we do budget for responding to those. But I think, Shima, I take your question more as, are we thinking about the new weather
Right.
and how we're doing that? And that's a good question. I'll pass back.
Okay, well, thank you, Director Cross. I very much appreciate that. That was actually, I think it's really helpful with the biennium of the budget to have this midpoint. And Manager Bennett, you were going to say something?
Nope. Oh, I was going to say, I'm glad we got a chance to do this. I hope it meets what you were hoping for. Last year, y'all had a sort of a hope that we would take a little deeper dive into sort of the strengths and weaknesses of the city. And I hope we've done that. If not, let us know.
Thank you. So in this next section, we have two folks who have completed their term on the Budget Committee, and I wanted to take this opportunity to thank them both, and I'm going to thank them individually if you'll indulge me. Lynn Carson, who has been our past chair of the Budget Committee, a vice chair. And I want to say, just coming onto the Budget Committee, Lynn was so welcoming, really took me on a tour of city council members. We met with a number of city council members. We met with a number of folks. She really was such a great and passionate advocate for the city, for learning, for asking questions to do that. And to volunteer for any kind of city committee takes a measure of civic engagement and passion for where you live. And I think Lynn has really exemplified that. So I wanted to say thank you for your 4 years on the committee.
Yay.
And I think Shannon, you were one of the first people I met. Every meeting you have been at the committee, you come in and have asked such thoughtful questions, and just really engaged with the committee. And I would want to thank you again. And same as Lynn, it takes a measure of commitment and love for where you live to volunteer for a committee, for a city committee, and I think particularly the budget committee. I also love your numbers, so I want to say thank you. And with that, my friends, we are adjourned and till we meet again next year.